welcome back. He's a luminary in the conservative movement. His new book is called Trump and the American Future. We're joined now by former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for joining us here on Newsmax Television.
Well, it's great to be with you.
10 years ago, you and I both spoke to a crowd of about 5,000 people gathered at City Hall Park in New York who were demanding limited, more responsive government. Today, that same park is being occupied by Marxists, by leftist organizers, anarchists, demanding the defunding of the police department. Democrats can't think this is a winning strategy. It's leaving a lot of Americans asking, how did we get to this point, Mr. Speaker?
Well, look, we've had 3 generations of brainwashing in which the university is going back to Herbert Marcuse at Berkeley in the early 60s. With every generation, they'd become more radical. And, of course, you look, for example, at the number of shootings in New York in the last 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. It's literally crazy that the worst mayor in America, de Blasio, cut $1 billion out of the police department. Look at Chicago, where there are 18 people killed in one day.
Yeah.
I think the average American knows that this whole left-wing, pro-criminal, anti-police model doesn't work. But that is, I think, what the Democrats are going to be stuck with when they run this fall.
Mr. Speaker, you're considered a historian by many, and deservedly so. And I see parallels between the tactics of the left and the Democrats today to other more authoritarian movements that we've seen in history. Do you see parallels that should be setting off alarm bells with Americans?
Sure. I mean, whether it's 1789 and the craziness of the French Revolution, which at one point renamed all of the months because the current name is inappropriate, or it was the Bolsheviks in 1917 with Lenin and Stalin, or Mao with the Cultural Revolution. All these are very similar patterns. They're all patterns of a militant minority willing to bully, push, intimidate, to impose the exact words at once. And that's what's, if you watch these folks, what's really sobering is not just are they violent, not just are they looting, not just are they occupying a space in Seattle where another person was killed last night, hardly becoming a summer of love, as the mayor of Seattle had promised. But in addition, these are people who, if you send the wrong tweet, they try to get you fired.
Yeah.
If you do the wrong thing as a college professor, they try to get you dismissed. The level of totalitarian pressure that is building is really something America's never seen before, and is frankly pretty scary.
It's one of the things that you talk about in the book is how this election could potentially fundamentally change this country. Can you give us some other examples?
Well, I mean, part of the reason I wrote Trump and the American Future is that I think this is the most important election since 1860 with Abraham Lincoln. And I say that because if you think about Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer as a team, not just Biden as an individual, and you look at, for example, H.R. 6800, which is the $3 trillion bill that Pelosi got 207 Democrats to vote for, which provides, for example, for a $1,200 check for every illegal immigrant in the country, and provides for releasing lots of criminals, including 6 serial murderers. Mm-hmm. The whole bill is filled with radicalism. And so I think that people need to recognize if the left captures the White House, the Senate, and the House, they will try within the first 2 years to make America somewhere between California and Seattle. And it's conceivable that we'll have a very hard time, if not impossible, to try to get our country back.
In 1988, Mr. Speaker, George H.W. Bush at this point in the campaign was down some 19 points to Dukakis. He was fighting what they called the wimp factor. He wasn't supposed to win, comes back and wins, and then 4 years later, because he's perceived as being disconnected from the public, he loses re-election. Do you believe that Trump is at this point on a similar trajectory? And what advice do you have, perhaps that's in the book, that do you have for the White House on how to regain its footing?
Well, part of the reason I wrote Trump and the American Future was to create sort of a campaign textbook. I mean, every major issue is in that book, and you can use it to argue with your friends and your neighbors. I think Trump's actually more like Harry Truman. Truman was behind. The news media had beaten him up. The Republicans were so confident that they were going to win, that they were naming their cabinet. He was so far behind in September that all the major polling firms stopped taking polls. And he came from behind with a very hard-hitting campaign. And I think when, if it's only a referendum on Trump, it's one election. But if it's a choice between Trump and the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer team, I think it's a very different election. And I think faced with a forceful communication of two things: why they are really terrible and dangerous, and second, what Trump would do in a second term that would really make America even better, even more prosperous, even safer. And I think he's got to lay that out as well as define Biden. If he does those two things, I predict he'll win re-election.
Mr. Speaker, before I let you go, I wanted to get your take on Chief Justice John Roberts, seeming to look like he is now the new swing vote on the High Court after we've seen some very high-profile decisions come down over the last couple of weeks.
Well, he's been an enormous disappointment.
Yeah.
I think that there's no consistency to what he does. There's no coherence. It's purely opportunistic. And it truly has been, he's been the most disappointing appointment, I think, in the last 20 years.
Mr. Speaker, best of luck with the new book, Trump and the American Future. Thank you for joining us here on Newsmax TV, and our very best to the ambassador as well.
Thank you very much.
Stay with us. You're watching The Chris Salcedo Show on Newsmax Television. We'll be right back.